Right. Morning, everyone. Welcome to this session on why accounting metrics can kill innovation and what to use instead, being presented by Steve Glaveski. Steve's a former accountant turned innovation consultant. He's a keynote speaker, author, blogger, and podcast host. He's co-founded Collective Campus, an innovation hub, school, and consultancy. And he works with the organizations to help them adopt mindset, methodologies, and tools needed to explore new business models and disruptive innovation in an era of rapid change. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Steve Glaveski. Steve is happy to take questions at the end of the session, and if you could also please remember to switch your mobiles on silent if you haven't done so. Thanks.
So much. That was easily the 7th best introduction I've ever had in my life. Probably helped that I wrote it as well, but anyway. One thing that wasn't mentioned in that introduction was that I'm notoriously bad at taking selfies. So come the end of this presentation, I'm going to take another selfie, but it's going to make a lot more sense when I do, because the moral of the story will become clear. Okay, so what do accountants love? Well, perhaps let's kick off with what they don't love. We don't like things that are ambiguous, things that we can't see, measure, things that, we like the exactitude of mathematics. We like it when we can see things, touch them, measure them, and when we know the outcome for sure. We love certainty. We love it when things grow in a predictable fashion, kind of like this strawberry here. But today, things are far from predictable. So for those of you in the back, you probably can't see this, but what I'm holding in my hand is an iPod Classic, right? It seems like just yesterday we were listening to iPod Classics and using iTunes, ripping CDs onto our computers so that we could digitize our entire music collection. I did that once. I spent months and months doing it. I must have been about 18 at the time. And then my hard drive fried because I left it out in the sun, which wasn't a very good idea. And today, what are we doing? We're far more likely to be listening to, say, Spotify or Pandora on our phones. All right? So things are moving and changing very, very quickly. And this is being reflected in the average company lifespan of large organizations. If you go back to the mid-20th century, the average company lifespan of an S&P 500 company was about 60 years. Today, that number is just 15, and it's tipped to hit 12 by 2025. In fact, more than 50% of the S&P 500 is likely to be replaced in 10 years' time at current rates of churn. So what's driving this? Well, essentially, Moore's law, the doubling of computing power every 2 years, is playing a big role. I mean, we've seen the advent of ubiquitous internet access, faster, better, cheaper. It's supporting things like cloud computing and various other technologies which are just lowering the barriers to entry for everybody. I mean, it used to be that you needed to have hundreds of millions of dollars in capital to get into certain industries, whereas today, kids in their teens are selling their products to the world online. But just to put Moore's law into perspective, if you take a 1 meter step today and double that every day for 30 days, guess how many steps you would have taken by the 30th day? So 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. Does anyone want to guess? 145 people subscribe to this session. One person's going to front up with an answer or a guess. Over 1 million? Thank you. Okay, so the actual number is 1,043,000,000 steps. 1,043,000,000 meters, right? So what does that work out to? It's the equivalent of walking around the world 26 times. So that gives us an indication as to how much of a profound impact Moore's law can have on business, on industry, on technology. Yeah. Now I feel really restricted, but that's cool. I can't do my whole Tony Robbins thing, get in the audience and
It's all good. Okay, so 26 times. So imagine the impact of technology on business when things are changing that rapidly. You know, Moore's Law has been around for about 100 years. And so now we're basically at a point in time where innovation is no longer something that we can reliably predict. You know, it's not like that strawberry I showed you a few moments ago. Innovation, especially early stage, new product development in large companies today, it looks a lot more like this. It's fraught with uncertainty. And it's bringing us to, I suppose, the coalescence of lots of different technologies. So we're at an inflection point in time where things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, virtual reality, augmented reality, blockchain, all this stuff is coalescing at the same time. And for what was, I suppose, for a long time, these technologies weren't good enough, now they're coming to a point where they are good enough, and they're coalescing. And when you bring them together, they become even more powerful. So if you go back, for example, the reason why I've got this chart up here is for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, most of the world was inhabited by farmers. We didn't evolve much. It wasn't until the early 20th century, you know, the dawn of the industrial age, that people moved on. I mean, 80% of the American population in 1900 were farmers. Today, that number is 2%. But now we're already facing another disruption. It took thousands of years before the industrial age came along, and now it's only another 100 years where digital is creating even way more impact than the industrial age could have. So we need to reframe what we think when it comes to investing in innovation. You know, it doesn't look like this. It's not linear. It looks a lot more like this. Which is exactly why venture capitalists, when they invest in early stage ideas, startups, disruptive technologies, they expect that 1 out of 10 of those investments is going to return a significant return to investors, right? So this is despite the fact that they've done their due diligence on the idea, on the tech behind the team, on the actual team itself. It doesn't matter how good that stuff is. There's so many uncertain variables when you're doing something new that you basically need to be sure of before you can be sure about the return on investment. You might have a great team, great idea, but maybe you've got the wrong pricing model, or maybe the wrong distribution channel. Maybe you're targeting 35 to 45-year-old women when you should be targeting 30 to 35-year-old women. And something as small as that can have a profound impact on the return on investment of your product. So I mentioned venture capitalists. 1 in 10 times they get it right. Amazon, their founder, Jeff Bezos, basically says that, you know, if you swing for the fences, you're going to strike out a hell of a lot, but you're also going to hit some home runs, right? If all you ever did was bunt, played the safe bet and just to get to first base, then that's all you can ever hope for. And so he doesn't just preach this, they actually live it, they practice this. Amazon actually runs a monthly failure award. So if you work for Amazon, you run an experiment, that experiment turns out to fail, you learn something, you share that learning with the rest of the organization so you can optimize that return on failure and other people don't make the same mistake, you qualify for this award. But actually no, you don't qualify unless you ran the experiment without permission. So how many of us in this room can say that, hey, if we ran an experiment without permission and it failed and we shared it with the whole organization, that we'd be publicly honored in that way? It's a very uncommon thing, but it speaks volumes about the culture that Jeff Bezos is trying to build. But the thing here that's important to remember is we're not advocating failing big. We're talking about very, very small failures. We're talking about failures that may cost the company $5,000. And if you're learning a hell of a lot and it stops you from making a $1 million failure or a $10 million failure, then is it a failure? Or should we just reframe the way we look at it and see it as an opportunity to learn with very little expense? So Sportsbet's another company where they're very progressive in the way they approach product development. Their head of innovation has actually set himself and his team a KPI of failing 90% of the time when they run experiments. They realize that if they set that bar any lower, then they're not thinking big and bold enough. Their head of innovation, Leslie Barry, is actually quite quite progressive when it comes to this stuff. So, for example, they recently launched an esports platform, which basically allows you to bet on video games. So, when he first proposed this idea internally, people started not necessarily laughing, but they didn't quite get it. Like, who's going to put money down to watch some people play FIFA or NBA Jam or whatever kids are playing these days? I think I'm showing my age there. But what he did was, and this is a lesson for people who are trying to get buy-in for anything, doesn't need to be for innovation, but when you're trying to get buy-in for something, it's way more powerful if you show as opposed to just tell. So what he did was he booked a 1-hour lunchtime session, sent invites out, basically put message boards or notice boards across the whole company, sent emails out saying, hey, we're running this esports session, come down, there's going to be food, there's going to be drinks, check it out. He hired some gamers to come along, got some screens set up, and all those people who were super skeptical about this came in, and within 5 minutes of watching people play video games against each other, they were like jumping up and down at the screen, yelling things out. They were super engaged. And at that point, having that conversation about, hey, can we run an experiment around esports and build a platform around it? That conversation became a lot more compelling for people who were in the room, which included senior stakeholders. And when it comes to thinking big and bold, it doesn't get much bigger or bolder than this. Does anyone know what this is? And a hint, it's not a cloud. Sky's the limit. Hey, that's a great philosophy. So this is actually SpaceX's Falcon rocket blowing up mid-air, exploding on its third public attempt to get into orbit. The third massive public failure for the organization and its chief protagonist, Elon Musk. But did they shy away from these failures, or did they learn something with each failure? They learned something, and on the fourth attempt, they successfully made it into orbit. And they've since done so multiple times, managing to not only make it to orbit, but to also land these rockets back on Earth, both on land and at sea. And they've done so at about 5 to 10% of the cost of organizations like NASA, who, whenever they want to make a decision, want to make sure that it's an absolute right decision. So they get everyone around the table and have meetings and meetings and meetings and meetings. And I don't remember the last time they actually launched anything. And so all the while, Elon Musk basically lived his philosophy that if you're not failing, you're not innovating. And he vowed to never give up. All right? So remember, 1 in 10 VC investments succeed. And VCs, that's their entire job, to invest in early stage innovation. Yet, in most large organizations, we expect to be right all of the time. And how can we do that unless we're prepared to take risks? I mean, you've got VCs who do due diligence on thousands and thousands of companies every year, constantly assessing emerging technologies, risky ideas, and still can't get it right more than 1 out of 10 times. So they take a big portfolio approach. Which brings me to this guy. Does someone want to name him? We've had some weird names come across in Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne. Anyone? Donald Trump? All right, let's call him Don. All right, so Don's got an idea that he thinks is going to just open up a new market for his company. So he proceeds to speak to someone from, say, innovation, or maybe his direct manager, and he is asked to complete a business case. And what do we ask him in that business case? Show me the ROI, or the net present value, the internal rate of return, payback period, market size. I can go on, but I won't. Which is all well and good. But if we're truly dealing with that early stage innovation where it just looks like a squiggly line and there's so many unknown variables, how can we truly predict with accuracy, reliability that this is ROI? After 3 years of this investment, we're going to build this, here's the market that's going to buy it, and this is how much money we're going to make. We don't know that. So we need to find ways to discover the answer to that question without spending tens of millions of dollars building something that nobody wants. The thing about metrics like ROI and NPVs, if you want to make them look good, you decrease the variable of time. And so what that means is we only ever focus on short-term incremental innovations, which definitely has has a purpose, but it comes at the cost of long-term vision, right? So if all we ever do is invest in the near term, we stretch our existing S-curves. But it doesn't help us catch the next S-curves, as smartphones did when they leapfrogged feature phones. And companies like Apple left Nokia far behind. And here's a few other organizations who invested a little bit too heavily in short-term incremental innovation, in stretching their S-curves. And Blockbuster, in fact, could have bought the next S-curve. So they could have purchased Netflix for $50 million. Today, Netflix is worth $41 billion, right? Blockbuster at their peak was a $5 billion company with 60,000 employees. Today, Netflix, with a $41 billion market cap, has just 4,000 employees. So that's 1/15 the amount of employees and more than 8 times the market cap. And this is a trend that we're seeing across lots of different industries, where companies successfully embracing or engaging emerging technologies and managing to do much more with much less. We've got Kodak up there. I mean, everybody knows that story. But not many people realize that the year that they filed for bankruptcy in 2012, with thousands of employees, Instagram was acquired that year by Facebook for $1 billion and had 13 employees. And today is worth more than $50 billion. So companies are oftentimes at the mercy of their business models. Compaq, when Dell came along and started selling mail order computers at a fraction of the cost that it would cost you to buy one at your local retailer, they couldn't simply just start selling stuff online because 100% of their computers were sold through retailer networks. That was the distribution channel. So if you suddenly started selling everything online at a discount, your distribution channels are going to say, hey, what the hell are you guys doing? And pull the plug on you, and suddenly 100% of your revenues are gone. So you need to build up that online channel before you just pull the plug on your existing model. And for a lot of companies, it's hard to do both. Which brings me back to good old Don. He's stuck in a bit of a quandary. He's got an idea that he wants to pursue, but he doesn't know the ROI. So he's got two options. He can either lie about the ROI, fudge the numbers, say, oh yeah, this is it, and engage in a little bit of hocus pocus. And we see this with startups pitching to venture capitalists all the time. Just to demonstrate that you have some sort of financial literacy, show me the cash flow statement, the balance sheet, the P&L. Not that any of it means anything, but hey, it shows that you're doing the financial dance, I like to call it. So he can do the dance, get some money, and pursue the idea that way. Well, chances are he'll probably just not pursue the idea, grow disgruntled, and leave the organization. And today, we need people like Don more than ever, because they're the ones that are asking questions and challenging the status quo. So we need to find a way to actively encourage people like that. In the off chance that we fund Don, what do? We give him too much money, because we're not built to give out, say, a few $100s to run a short experiment. If we give him too much money, what happens? We have a team around Don. We have inflated expectations. We start having lots and lots of meetings. The product becomes more complex. We add more features. Costs blow out. And what was supposed to be a simple experiment ends up costing hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not more, taking more time than it was supposed to. And is the benefits realization there? Well, in 70% of the time when it comes to IT projects, the large organizations actually fail. And the number one reason was unnecessary complexity. And so if you're still not convinced, here's another case study I want to show you. And everybody knows Airbnb, but a few years ago, co-founder Brian Chesky actually published some rejection letters from venture capitalists. So this wasn't corporate venture arms, this was venture capitalists who perhaps you could argue should know better. What did these rejection letters say? So the potential market opportunity did not seem large enough for our required model. And today, Airbnb's market cap is bigger than that of the Marriott, of the Starwood. I'm not sure if it's bigger than places like Crown. But not only that, not only is their market cap bigger, but they don't own any assets. So their return on assets is astronomically greater. And so this is the thing when it comes to new ideas, if we look at things from a perspective of traditional metrics such as market size, the market may not exist, or the market might be really small. Can we grow that market incrementally? Can we place lots of small bets to figure out whether or not this is something that will deliver that return on investment in a few years' time? And the answer is yes. So we're dealing with this, and metrics such as these will slow us down when it comes to experimenting and taking small bets. And at this point, I want to introduce you to a set of metrics that are successfully used by organizations across the world when it comes to early stage innovation. And at this point, I also want to just stress that when it comes to innovation, a startup and a corporate innovation team have one very important thing in common. They are both temporary organizations looking to find product market fit. That's the number one job. Once they find product market fit, then we can start to treat them as a traditional business. Then we can put processes in place, systems, checks and balances, make sure things just work. But until you do that, there's no point putting an organization around something if there's no product market fit, if you've built something that there's no appetite for. And so these metrics are called pirate metrics, affectionately so, because if you take the first letter of each word, what does it spell? What was that? Thank you. It was R, for those of you who didn't hear it. So this is a model from Dave McClure. He's the founder of 500 Startups, one of the world's biggest startup incubators based in Silicon Valley. And this model can help us validate problem, solution, customer, price, with as little as a few $100s, in some cases under $100, depending on what you're testing. And so how do we go about doing this? Well, I'm going to show you an example of a piece of work we did with a health insurer to validate, or invalidate more importantly, so they don't end up wasting money building the wrong thing, whether the problem identified was actually a problem, the solution identified solved that problem, and whether the customer segment we were chasing actually cared. So first and foremost, you want to test acquisition, which is all about the problem. And in this case, our assumption was that people who work in hospitality don't have time to look after themselves. That's a problem. So how do we test that? Simply by running a Facebook ad with targeted imagery, targeted copy, which basically says, no time to look after yourself. We are an online platform that helps you track and manage your health and well-being. And you could run these very targeted ads. I could target people who work in hospitality between certain ages, male, female, from particular cities. I could even target inner suburbanites. So, you know, all the hipsters out there who work in hospitality, who live close to the city, right? And that way, I was able to get relevant feedback. And so we ran these ads and we found, say, the click-through rate was something like 1%. And for most online platforms, anything between 2 and 3% is good. Anything above that's great. So 1% is not bad, but let's run some more ads. And you can run concurrently lots of different problem sets. Because with most startup success stories, the initial problem, the initial idea, and the one that becomes a success usually look completely different. And so by placing lots of small bets, you can start to make those changes based on real customer feedback to get to that product market fit. So if someone clicked on the ad, then they'd come along to our landing page, where we'd start to talk a little bit more about the actual solution. And we wouldn't bombard them with pages and pages of information as you might expect on, say, a government intranet site. This is what the product is, here's the solution, and if you're interested, click the blue button, and we'll give you early access. And at that point, you'll collect an email address. And that's one way to validate customer behavior, real customer behavior. Because if you think about focus groups, when you run a focus group, chances are you've paid those people to be there. So are they really your best sort of sample size? Number two, when you're in a focus group, there's a lot of groupthink going on, right? And you're never really testing whether or not someone will pay for your product. Like I could be in a focus group and say, oh yeah, that's a great idea, I'd totally pay for that, but I'm not asked to put money down. And by using this approach, we can actually model real-world customer behavior and appetite to buy, which I'll get to in a second. With any online product, or any product at all, retention is always much better than acquisition, right? Because you're not paying to acquire the customer over and over and over and over and over again. So we want to retain that person. And so by taking a very data-driven approach, you can do that. And so we can track what percentage of people are actually coming back to our product. Because sometimes it's not the first exposure where people buy, it's not the 5th, sometimes it's the 10th or the 15th exposure to your product that gets them over the line. Usually you're just planting seeds in their heads around brand awareness. And so you want to retarget them. How many times have we been on a website and then suddenly that website or that brand's been following us all over the internet? Facebook, Google, websites that we visit, that's just a form of retargeting. And you can retarget people for as little as 20 to 30 cents a click. And finally, if people are leaving their email address on your site, let's contact them, let's get them to come back. Maybe we can ask them a question saying, hey, you left your email address, but you haven't engaged. Why? What did you like about it? What did you not? What would you like to see? This feedback then goes back into our initial assumption set, and we start moving, build, measure, learn as fast as we possibly can to find that product market fit. And so this is an exciting case study about how you can track, or test rather, customer appetite to buy. So this is a company called Buffer. Buffer is a social media tool. They've been around for about 7 years now, and what it does, it helps you essentially tweet, post, whatever you call it, across multiple platforms. So if you want to tweet on Twitter, you want to post on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, at the same time, with one button, you can do that with Buffer, right? But when Buffer came along, such software didn't exist. There's a few applications like this today. So they set up a website which literally you could set up in half an hour. The first page basically said, this is what we do, add your tweets to your Buffer, set up a schedule, and we'll do the rest. And if that sounded simple and compelling enough, you'd click the green button, which said plans and pricing. Then you'd see, well, if you want to tweet once a day, it's only, well, it's free. But if you're going to tweet once a day, do you really need software? Probably not. If you want to tweet 10 times a day, it's $5. Unlimited was $20. And so if people then clicked on $5 or $20, what do you think happened? A little pop-up box appears saying, sorry, we're not quite ready yet, but leave your email address and we'll let you know when we are. So this was a way for them to track real customer behavior around appetite to buy. And they actually collected 10,000 email addresses taking this approach in a matter of 4 weeks. And so if you collect 10,000 emails of people who have clicked $5 and $20, is that a good validation? I mean, does that suggest that it's worth building this product? And finally, a referral. Given that we're at an accounting conference, I thought I'd throw up a formula. So this is a viral coefficient. I mean, a lot of people talk about, hey, we've got to go viral, we've got to make this product go viral, but no one knows what that means, how you do that, how you track it. And this quite simply says, well, for every customer you have, how many people do they refer to the product, and what percentage of those people convert? So if they refer 10 people and 30% convert, then that's a viral coefficient of 3. Anything above 1 is positive. But the first step is understanding where you are today, having the processes in place to track that, and then start doing things to increase that virality. So these are a few examples that I've shown, I guess, were a little bit more digital. So what can you do if you're not an online software company? So Medibank, health insurance, private health insurance company, they released a product a couple of years ago called Gym Better. They wanted to determine whether or not there was appetite for this. So Gym Better was a product that allowed you to visit lots of gyms across the country, which they were targeting young professionals who travel a lot for work. And I know when I was working for a consultancy and traveling across Asia quite a bit, one of my pet peeves was not being able to access a gym without having to pay, say, $30 for a casual day pass. So I do what a lot of people do and download these 3-day vouchers and turn up to the front desk and be like, yeah, I just moved to Singapore, can I check out the gym? And I'd do this all over town until there was like wanted posters up. But they stumbled upon a serious pain point. But they wanted to test whether or not the market thought this was a pain point and that the market was willing to pay. So if you're targeting young professionals who like to work out, what do? You go out to places like Virgin Health and Fitness First, hang out there at about 6 p.m., wait for young professionals with their gym bags and suits to turn up. Intercept them, have a conversation. Try and sell them this policy that doesn't exist yet. And funnily enough, a lot of people wanted to sign up on the spot. Of course, it didn't exist, so they were given some gold-class movie tickets. Thank you for your cooperation. But this was a way for them to say, yes, look, this is valid. We spoke to so many people. Here's some changes we should make based on the feedback. Here's the number of people that actually wanted to buy the product. This was how much they were willing to spend. Let's take this data and make sure we get this right. Because you can't just put products onto the market if you're an insurance company. You've got to go through the regulator. So you need to find smart ways to experiment before you spend tons of money doing your checks and balances on a new insurance policy. IBM, they wanted to test customer appetite for dictation software. So dictation software, how do you test that? Well, IBM being IBM, lots of meetings, they basically ran a partition down a meeting room. One side of that room, you'd have them meeting with clients and partners and prospects, and there'd be a projector up on the wall, which was wired to a laptop in the next room, where someone was listening to the conversation and typing away. Really simple hack. But people in the room thought, oh, what's this? It's projecting everything I'm saying. Oh, it's just some new software we're working on. What do you think? Oh, this will make our life so much better. We won't have to take minutes and so on. But it was just a really easy way for them to test customer appetite based on real behavior. Rent the Runway, as the name suggests, a platform which allows you to rent design addresses. Started by two college students, university students, about 5 years ago. If you're renting design addresses on the internet, you've got a few assumptions, right? I mean, one would be that people will return dresses in a good fashion. I don't know about you, but every time I go to the races, people look very different at the end of the day as opposed to the start of the day. So you want to make sure that those dresses come back without all sorts of stuff on them. That's one assumption. Number two is, will they actually pay to rent dresses? Some people just like to pay to own things, right? And number three, the most important one, is if I'm renting a Chanel dress online, not that I wear Chanel dresses, is it going to fit? Right? So how do you test this? Well, what they did, they hired two rooms at two different universities. One was at Harvard, the other was Yale. They put posters up all over campus saying, hey, come down, rent the runway, we're renting out design addresses. And then they wanted to track for for every 100 people that turned up, what percentage rented dresses, returned them in good fashion, and would rent the dresses without trying them on. So the first time they ran the test, they let people try the dresses on. 10% rented. The next time they ran the test, they didn't. So what do you think happened to that conversion rate? It went down, of course, but it dropped to about 3%. And if you recall what I said earlier, 3% for an online business is still pretty good because your market is millions and millions of people online. And so they got enough data and they got some feedback to take the idea forward. And today, Rent the Runway is worth over $1 billion. Google Glass, a discontinued Google product nonetheless, but when they were building this, they wanted to build a prototype to test whether or not whether their idea resonated with people. So how would you go about doing that? How long would it take? Any guesses? A year to build a prototype for Google Glass, basically an iPhone for your eyes. 5 years? It was 1 day, right? And they did so just using existing products that are on the screen. They even used coat hanger wire to put the glasses around your head. But the purpose of this was to start getting feedback from day one, so they didn't waste time and money allocating resources to something that wasn't wanted or to the wrong thing. Getting that feedback early means you're taking more and more small bets to figure out what customers want. And there's so many other things going on. 3D printing is becoming cheaper and faster. Cardboard prototypes, great case study, and this is actually a friend's company, but they launched a product on Kickstarter, which allows you to test customer appetite as well as raise money. They raised $47,000 in 15 days. And how did they do that? Simply by leveraging the power of the internet to get in front of hundreds of thousands of people for free. Well, not for free, it cost them about $50. So they basically hired a virtual assistant And that virtual assistant would put together a list of all the fashion bloggers, all the prominent fashion bloggers on the internet. This list was about 200 long. And all these bloggers have somewhere between 10,000 and 50,000 followers. She sent them a script saying, hey, we're Winston, we're launching this Kickstarter campaign, this is what we're about, we'd love it if you supported us, if you do, we'll send you a free watch. And about 50 of these bloggers wrote about Winston on day one of the campaign, which got the brand in front of several 100,000 people, if not more. And on day one, they hit their target. So the reason I show you this is because it's a great way and a very cheap way, and that you can apply to lots of different things to determine customer appetite for your product. Dropbox. So before Dropbox was actually a thing, today there's lots of cloud storage companies. They wanted to determine whether or not people would actually pay for online storage. And so they put together
Okay, my name's Drew,
this video.
and I'll be showing you a quick tour of Dropbox, which is a new way to store and share files online. What makes Dropbox different is that it just works, and there isn't any complicated setup or interface to learn. So let's get started. I've already installed Dropbox on a Windows PC and put a bunch of files in, and now I want to sync these files to my Mac. So to do that, I just installed Dropbox, and now I'm linking my Mac to my account. So in a second, my account will be linked, and you can see that the files that were on my Windows PC will start coming down. And what we're looking at is my Dropbox folder, which looks and acts like any other folder except for two things. One, these little green icons that indicate files are up to date, and two, anything in my Dropbox is synced across all of my computers and to the web. And you'll notice that when I make changes.
Okay, so I won't show you the whole thing in the interest of time, but this product didn't actually exist yet. It was smoke and mirrors that they just put together, and they promoted it through developer communities online. They promoted it through a third-party platform called Dig. And literally overnight, they collected 60,000 emails of people that wanted this product. And so if you collect 60,000 emails, does that give you comfort that it's worthwhile building this? Definitely. So all of these processes are more or less underlined by the philosophy behind the lean startup, which is build fast, measure fast, learn fast, rinse and repeat as fast as you can. Companies that learn the fastest are more likely to win. And it doesn't just apply to small organizations. You're probably thinking, well, we're a big behemoth and we're very bureaucratic. GE taught 5,000 middle managers the lean startup philosophy. This is a company with over 200,000 employees, 260 billion US market cap, over 100 years old. They taught 5,000 middle managers the philosophy because they realized that if they didn't, they would become obsolete not in 30, 40, or 50 years, but in the next 10 years alone. And so what's come of their experiment? Well, they've radically decreased time to market for things like diesel engines, medical devices, industrial circuit breakers, and most importantly, in their industrial division, they cut time to market validation for new ideas by 80%, which means you not only save a lot of money, but suddenly you've got 5 times as much money to spend on running like experiments. And so the more experiments you run, the more ideas you test, just like the venture capitalists, the more likely you are to stumble upon that game-changing idea that creates a new market for your organization. And so when it comes to innovation in large companies, or when it comes to innovation at all, small teams are favored. Small teams that have a relentless focus on solving customer problems and just who are engaged in rapid experimentation. And so as accountants, you can all play a role in empowering people in your organization to create value, to create impact. And so I call on you when you are presented with a business case or when an employee says, hey, I've got this idea to test, to encourage an alternative approach. Find a way to allocate $500 to that idea as opposed to go through the whole rigmarole of a business case. Because there's no certainty when it comes to innovation. But one thing is definitely certain: if we take a lot of small bets instead of few large ones, we're far more likely to succeed. Thank you. We have about 6 minutes for questions.
Steve, can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
So this relates to the creating the teams. You talked about ensuring there's small teams. You find that mindsets are quite different. So people who can, think of ideas and evaluate How do you manage that?
Sure. So 100%, you need different, yep, sorry. So the question was, how do you manage people coming together with different views of the world? And my answer would be that, firstly, they need to understand this approach, so the lean startup, so whether that's some sort of training, just to get people on the same page, because you can't have people in there saying, oh, we need to put this through risk and compliance before we do anything, and while the other person says, no, let's just build a website and we'll just test it under some unbranded logo. You definitely need people to be aligned in that way, but it shouldn't be about, hey, I think this idea is great, let's build this. By taking this approach, you're going to let the market tell you whether or not the idea is great. And so by having a data-driven approach to things, you're going to have less arguments. For example, if a company is doing really well, what you find is sales takes the credit, marketing says, oh, it was our marketing campaign, product will say, oh, it's the new features we released last week. But if the company is doing badly, everybody kind of steps back into the shadows. And so by using data traceable to certain things that you've done, so whether it's a marketing campaign, sales approach, whatever it is, that way you've got more of a black and white answer and you can keep people on the same page. But yeah, it is definitely important. With GE, one thing I didn't mention was that once they trained everyone in the lean startup, actually getting it to work was a different matter because the culture didn't support it. The culture was steeped in Lean Six Sigma. It was steeped in inside the building thinking. They did not have a history of approaching customers from day one and engaging in that customer-centric product development. And that culture, those values had to change, and they completely scrapped their old values and came up with new ones to support this. And while I think 99 times out of 100 company values don't equate to much, in this case it meant that they could support a different way of thinking and a different way of acting when it came to innovation. And the numbers speak for themselves in terms of decreasing that time to market validation for new ideas and just getting products to market much quicker. One more. Cool. Yep, so the question was, if GE does use this approach and comes across an idea where there's enough validation to say that it's going to be commercially viable, should they not leave it on the outside until they can bring it inside? Yeah. That's a great question, and most of the time it's best to leave these organizations on the outside. Most companies that are trying to innovate will, rather than teaching employees internally, rather than changing the culture, they'll say, okay, let's just build these satellite organizations with their own KPIs, their own systems, processes, values, everything's on the cloud, they can build experiments quickly. And sometimes it may be best just to leave them on their own forever. Because if you're integrating them back into the mothership is going to kill their culture, what made them great, their fast-moving abilities, then you're probably just going to kill a good thing. Unless you can integrate them in a way where let's integrate just the intellectual property, let's integrate stuff that's going to make us better internally, then you're best to leave them on their own. So that is a great question. And that's why a lot of companies are setting up innovation outposts now. Innovation outposts, startup incubators, where large companies will invest in, say, a pool of 10 or 20 organizations. Barclays are doing this all the time. Every year they run the Barclays Accelerator. They've incubated something like about 150 teams, I think, exploring lots of different fintech opportunities and solutions. So 100%. There's an example of one of the big four banks who acquired an independent product, and they spent about $5 million acquiring that company and spent $4 million integrating it into the mothership, and absolutely killed everything that made the company great. The founders left, and now that particular organization is left holding a lemon that they spent $9 million for. So you need to know when to integrate and when to leave things be. But if you do want to do this internally, it's a marathon and not a sprint, and it requires going from snowflake to avalanche. It's not something that you can change overnight, especially if you've got these entrenched values that have been there from day dot, and certain facets of the organization don't get it at all. So there are ways to counter that, and in some cases, Australia Post, sorry I'm going off on lots of tangents here, Australia Post wanted to start running experiments like this. Their IT teams wanted to start doing things outside the box, and senior management were having none of it. So what did the IT team do? They took it into their own hands. Like I said, show, don't tell. They spent weekends and after hours building prototypes to solve customer problems, to solve internal problems. Then they got together and they actually presented these prototypes to decision makers, asking for forgiveness, not permission. And the decision makers loved the ideas so much that now they have company-sponsored boot camps on a monthly basis where people from across the organization get together to build new ideas. And some of those ideas have now taken that next step and actually become full-blown commercial products. So there's always, where there's a will, there's a way. But I hope that answered your question in a not too convoluted way, going off on lots of tangents. Yes?
Do you find that Australia is remaining competitive with the incentives that other countries are offering on innovation?
It's a great question. So do I find that Australia is remaining competitive compared to some of the other countries who are offering greater incentives? I'd say we are remaining competitive, but I'd say it's in spite of not receiving the same incentives that other companies are getting. We've had a great culture here when it comes to innovation, whether it's large organizations or whether it's startups. I mean, we look at countries like Singapore who have invested, say, $2 billion in venture capital. Up until recently, Australia was only investing between $100 and $200 million, so 10% of the funding pie. But in Australia, we've got quite a few case studies, Atlassian, Campaign Monitor, Canva. There's been a lot of companies that have come out in the last 5 years alone who've done amazing things on the world stage, whereas I can't name that many from places like Singapore who've done the same. So I think we've got a great culture of just getting stuff done, but we also have this tall poppy syndrome. We also have a very risk-averse society and culture, especially in corporate Australia, and I think that needs to change. Otherwise, our best talent's probably going to go overseas to work for more progressive organizations. Thank you.
So please join me in thanking Steve for a very interesting